free food opportunities. So we called it when I was back in college. Those events we'd seek out. There's a case where we can get food for nothing. Even now in the church or when we have community events, sometimes that's what we do. So we try to draw people, young and old, with the prospects of food. And I guess it wasn't too much different in the time of Jesus. Remember last week, Jesus performed his miracle of the multiplication of the 5,000, the loaves and the fishes. And this week, we continue reading from that same chapter, John chapter 6. So after this miracle, Jesus had tried to go off by himself to pray, but the crowds ended up following him back to the town of Capernaum. And they did so because, as Jesus says in the gospel today, you are looking for me not because you saw signs, not because of the miracle, but because you ate the loaves and were filled. When they saw his miracle of this multiplication, some of them last week called him the prophet, but it seems that most were interested just in his ability to provide for material needs. And some of them wanted to make him king for that reason. Many today are interested in secular leaders for that same reason. Who promises to give us the most free stuff? But Jesus didn't come just to give us things. As we follow Jesus' conversation with these people today and over the next 3 weekends, we keep reading it, we'll see that Jesus came for something much more important than only temporary provisions. He came to provide what will nourish our souls for eternity as our divine King. So let's follow his conversation. Jesus begins by telling them, in response to them searching out free food, he says, do not work for food that perishes, but for food that endures for eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you. And we can ask ourselves, what do we spend our time working for? Do I work mainly for earthly things? Or do I make sure that I strive for treasures in heaven? Do we desire God's will above everything? And hopefully we will be able to answer in the way that the people respond. They also wanted to do God's will, and they asked Jesus, what can we do to accomplish the works of God? Before we make our decisions each day, we ought to start by praying that way. God, what do you want me to do this day? What do you want me to do in this situation? And Jesus in this passage tells us where to start. He says, this is the work of God, that you believe in the one he sent. So our first task every day is to believe in the one God sent, to believe in Jesus, to trust him, to trust that Jesus, he loves us, and he's present each day to guide us. Jesus in that passage even uses a divine title, the Son of Man, in order that they come to know that he is indeed from God, that they'll trust and follow him. As they were getting to know Jesus, it was at first really difficult to believe that he was God. Maybe it's easier for us now. But the crowds respond by asking Jesus for a sign. What sign can you do that we may see and believe in you? Jesus, what can you do to prove that you're from God? And sometimes we think the same way today, right? We got to have proof before we ever believe something. But didn't Jesus just give them a sign? Didn't he just do the miracle of the multiplication of the loaves and fishes? Shouldn't that have proved that he's from God? Well, it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough for them. They say, our ancestors ate manna in the desert. What can you do? They're referring back to what we read in the first reading today. That back at the time the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt, God called Moses to free them, and as they were traveling back to the promised land, they did so through the desert, and God provided for their needs by giving them this heavenly food, this manna, Moses had ensured that they were fed with that bread for the 40 years that they were going through the desert. But Jesus, on the other hand, he just fed them one day. Not as impressive. So Jesus, if you really are from God, as you say you are, can you do something greater than Moses and the manna? That's what they're asking. So Jesus reminds them that it was God who gave them that bread. It wasn't Moses. Only God can do something like that. Only God can give them bread that really will bring them life. Okay, that sounds good. Jesus, give us this bread. That's what they say. Because they want to be fed each day, just like their ancestors had been. And then Jesus makes this really amazing claim. He says, I am the bread of life. Now, we're probably used to hearing Jesus called the bread of life, so maybe that doesn't stick out as much in our mind, but it should, because it's absolutely incredible what he's saying. He says, I am the bread of life. Now, the phrase that he starts with, I am, has really important meaning. When Moses had met God and God had called him to lead his people out of slavery, Moses asked God for his name so that the people would know who it was that was bringing Moses there. And so God told Moses his name. He says, I am who I am. Tell the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. I am. In Hebrew, that's where we get God's name, Yahweh. And so when Jesus says, I am the bread of life, he's taking the very name of God for himself. He is explicitly, very clearly telling them that he is God, that he himself is God. Moses was a man sent by God, and through Moses they received this food for their bodies. But Jesus is not just a man. Jesus is God himself. And so Jesus is a kind of new manna, a new bread from heaven. In the Old Testament, God fed them with bread for their bodies, but now he feeds them with his very self, food for our souls. In the past, they just got bread, and now we get the bread of life. And if we understand Jesus correctly, this is an amazing thing. So amazing that it was really difficult for them to believe that Jesus is God and that he himself is our food. Next week, the passage will continue and we'll see what were the crowd's reactions to Jesus' words. But until then, we want to consider, well, what's my reaction to Jesus' words? Do I truly believe that Jesus is God, as he says he was? Am I Catholic because I just want the things that God can give me, the free stuff? As good as those might be, good weather, abundant crops, sufficient money, health, family, happiness, a friendly community. Or am I Catholic because I personally am in a relationship with the Lord? From talking with him, from spending time in prayer to receiving him in the sacraments, that's what brings me life. For as good as those earthly things may be, they're kind of still like the Old Testament manna. They're good for our earthly life. But there's so much more that God desires to give to us. He wants to give us himself. So do I love God just for those good things that he provides? Or do I love God because he is God? God who is all good and deserving of my love.